Welcome, everyone, to this episode of the Fired Up and Plugged In podcast powered by Emergency Reporting. This is the podcast for all 21st century fire and EMS personnel. I'm Tom Lewis, Enterprise Training Manager and the podcast producer. Our topic today will be part one of two with our guests. We will be discussing environmental factors that affect the physiological and mental health of the first responder. Our host is retired Fire Chief Randy Brugman. During his 40-year career in local government, Chief Brugman was the president of the International Association of Fire Chiefs from 2002 to 2003. He also served as the president of the board of directors for the Center for Public Safety Excellence from 2004 to 2017. We're grateful to have him as a member of our customer advisory board here at Emergency Reporting. Our guest today is Dr. Kristen Willeumier. Dr. Willeumier is a neuroscientist with expertise in neuroimaging and psychiatric disorders. She earned Master of Science degrees in Physiological Science and Neurobiology, as well as a PhD degree in Neurobiology from UCLA. He was a postdoctoral scientist in the Department of Neurology at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, working in the field of neurodegenerative disease, and she was the recipient of a fellowship award from the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Willeumier is a widely published author in peer-reviewed journals, including the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, Translational Psychiatry, and the Journal of Neuroscience. She is also the author of Biohack Your Brain, How to Boost Cognitive Health, Proficiency, and Power. We're privileged to have her with us today, and we thank all of you for joining us. So let's start the podcast. Chief Brugman.
Thanks, Tom, and good day, everyone, and welcome back to another session of Fired Up and Plugged In. And today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kristen Willeumier, who is, as Tom said, is a neuroscientist and someone that I've known for probably the past decade, and she has become a very dear friend of not only myself, but our entire family. So welcome, Kristen.
Welcome, Chief. Oh, thank you, Chief Brugman and Tom. It's such a pleasure to be here with you both this morning, and I'm fired up and plugged in and ready to go.
Well, that's good. We're glad to hear that. So, in the past, we've had a lot of discussions about the impacts that fire and emergency service personnel face daily and its effect on long-term health. And I know we've talked specifically about the exposures to toxic environments and witnessing of multiple traumatic events, and the constants sleep deprivation or sleep disruption that often a lot of fire personnel have to go through. And they all have long-term impacts on the health and welfare of our personnel. So just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on that today, and we'll kind of delve into it as we get into the discussion. But what are your thoughts? Why don't we start with the environmental piece of it and the exposures?
Absolutely, because all three of those are really critical to your long-term brain health. So toxic environment. As you know, we are all exposed to toxins in our environment, even those of us who are not firefighters. We have to think about those endogenous toxins like the pesticides and herbicides that are on our foods that we consume, the excess sugar that most Americans are consuming on a daily basis, the artificial sweeteners and food preservatives, the alcohol, tobacco, smog, petrochemicals, heavy metals, exposure to virus, bacteria, and pollutants in our tap water. So we're also exposed to toxins just produced in our body from metabolic function and poor digestion. So on top of that, those of you who are in the fire service are also exposed to toxins in the environment from exposure to smoke and carbon monoxide poisoning. You've got hydrogen cyanide from the burning of plastics and metals. You've got asbestos that's in the air from the burning of buildings. You've got the exposure to polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons from your brush and forest fires, along with formaldehyde, diesel exhaust, and chemicals from fuel spills and gas leaks. So that's a lot of environmental exposure. And coming from a neuroimaging background where I've seen thousands of brain scans, one of the things that's really important in taking care of the health of your brain is number one, reducing toxic exposure, because those toxins that can get into the circulatory system can then go into the cells in our brain and even our fat cells and stay within our system. So we have to be really smart about doing strategies to help eliminate these toxins from our body. And truth be told, I think firefighters need to really be thoughtful about making sure they take care of reducing toxic exposure as much as possible.
You talked about and you brought up a really good point of just, I guess, the pathway into your system. And it's not only airborne, is it? It's also can be absorbed through your skin.
Yeah, one of the most common routes of entry can be through the scalp, the forehead, the neck, the jaw. So on your skin, it's on your clothing. And, you know my father's been in the fire service, or was in the fire service for 25 years, and, would come home with covered in dust and soot, and it would be on his clothing. He'd bring it into the house. So that's very common.
Yeah, I know it's something that we've finally recognized, I think, in the fire and emergency services, but we still have a long way to go to minimize that exposure. And part of the minimization of the exposure is, not having to put your people in those kind of situations in the first place. We've looked at the links between these exposures and the increased cancer rates in firefighters, which are pretty high as compared to the just general population. But are there other diseases or other health conditions that can also be prevalent for emergency responders based upon, the exposures that they've received over their career?
Well, absolutely. Other health risks to emergency personnel, and I know this is one of the things you brought up, are increase in sleep disorders. So a lot of people in the emergency service have issues with sleep apnea, insomnia, and shift work disorder. Emergency personnel are at a heightened risk for cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, mental health disorders like anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and they're at greater risk of substance abuse. So all of these things, if left untreated, can really accelerate brain aging and lead to chronic degenerative diseases and cancers.
Yeah. Are there other diseases that emerge, from some of these exposures, or just some of the environmental factors that the first responders face with?
Well, I think environmental exposures really increase your risk of all diseases, right? Because we can't have toxins being stored in the body. We need to make sure that we're continually working on ways to release these toxins from the body.
Mm-hmm. So, over the last 4 to 5 years, in at least in California, but it's happening all throughout the U.S. But the rate of forest urban interface fires and some of the toxins that are released there, and I often wonder, there's not been much research for our fire personnel when they're exposed over long periods of time without any breathing apparatus. Sometimes they're on the line for 2 or 3 days. What's your thought, on that issue?
You mean with them being on the line for 2 or 3 days with no sleep and chronic toxic exposures?
It's sometimes lack of.
It is a disaster for your brain health. Well, that opens up a whole nother dialogue on just sleep disruption and shift work in firefighters. So, disrupted sleep from a brain health perspective, there's 3 critical functions that we say happen during sleep. One, we take all of the memories that we have during the day and consolidate them from short-term into long-term. So when we have chronic sleep deprivation, we start to have issues with concentration, focus, and memory problems. Number 2, chronic sleep deprivation can impact our ability to clear abnormally folded proteins in the brain that can lead to Alzheimer's disease. So by having this sort of chronic sleep deprivation, we're accelerating our risk of getting degenerative diseases. And number three, which I think is really most critical to people in the fire service, is that when we sleep, that's when we can help to regulate our emotions. So the things that we see during the day, especially things that are emotionally traumatizing, we can work through during our sleep. And what very interesting paper that was published recently had shown that when we sleep, we can unlearn fear-related memories. So given that people in the fire service are constantly witnessing death, and you're putting yourselves in sort of harm's way, these are all things that are emotionally triggering and jarring. So over time, if we're sleep deprived, we're not able to work through all of that. And that's what's leading to the mental health issues, the stress, the anxiety, the depression, the PTSD that we're really seeing in the fire service. So those are, again, from a brain health perspective, those are sort of top of line things that I think about with sleep, but also sleep disruption increases activity in our nervous system. So it sort of increases the stress response, and we have metabolic effects, changes in our circadian rhythm, and it increases inflammation in the body. So again, you've got an increase in stress, you've got reduced quality of life, you've got emotional distresses, increases in mood disorders, and changes in cognition and memory.
Yeah, I think it's really a trifecta for, I think, fire and emergency personnel that we often don't think about. When we get into the business. I mean, most firefighters today just covet the 24-hour shift and the time off that they have. But if you couple that with, as you said, with the exposures that are received sometimes multiple times a day, and the witnessing of trauma multiple times a day, and then you don't have any sleep to help you kind of work through all of those things, it's just not a good recipe for long-term health.
No,
I think we really need to step back and realize we have to kind of change the way we do business to protect our people.
Yeah, and I think it's really about protecting your long-term health and making sure that, yes, you not only get through the 3 decades or 4 decades of service that you give as a firefighter, but what about when you retire? When you have to retire, we want your retirement years to be as vital and full of joy and happiness as you did when you were a firefighter. And trust me, I had a father who was sleep deprived, who exposed himself to environmental toxins, right? He lived this life, witnessed innumerable deaths. I mean, he was a military veteran, as you know, combat helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and a firefighter, and actually loved every minute of it. I don't think my father would change anything, but as you know, he was then diagnosed with Parkinson's when he retired. So if he could do things differently, I'm sure, hindsight's always 20/20, and that's why, it's really such an honor to be here talking with you today, because I want people just to take a more thoughtful approach to taking care of their sleep hygiene, taking care of their mental health, getting mental health issues treated if need be, and really even having a dialogue about the exposure to sort of post-traumatic stress or traumatic events, because I will tell you, I don't think my dad really thought much about it. He was a very emotionally balanced man, very happy, optimistic. But I feel like all of the traumatic events he saw, he just sort of sequestered them away, in an area of his brain and didn't really process that. And I feel that's probably very common to those who are in the fire service, right? Am I right? You just
no. I think
you accept.
Right. We have a tendency, I think, in the emergency services to be able to, or not tendency. I think we potentially learn this or teach our brains to do this, but we're very good at compartmentalization. We put things in little boxes, whether it's the traumatic event or That's just, that's just kind of how we operate. Because if you're going on, 10, 20, 30 calls a day, you're going to see a lot of stuff and you can't carry it around with you every day. But somehow you got to get rid of that, right?
You absolutely have to get rid of it. And I think you're going to appreciate this story. When I was doing my undergraduate degree at Boston College, I was a psychology major. And I remember my father was not proud of that. He's like, why do you want to be a psychologist and listen to people's problems all day, right? He said that could be really emotionally draining on you. And I never forgot him telling me that, especially somebody who here was in the fire service and had seen a lot of trauma, and even being in the military, had seen a lot of death. And I think he was trying to sort of buffer me from having to work in a profession where I would sit and listen all day to other people's traumas. Needless to say, I took his advice and went more into the neurosciences and whatnot. But, in looking back on that, I think men especially really need to take a look at being more open to learning how to process the kind of stress and trauma that they see on a daily basis. Because remember, all of that is going into our subconscious mind, right? Everything that we are exposed to in the day, everything we see, hear, feel, touch, it's all being recorded in our brain. And we may be able to compartmentalize it, but it doesn't mean that it's not affecting us physiologically. And that's where the brain imaging, my background in brain imaging has really been sort of fascinating for me to see, because I see what trauma looks like in the brain. It actually has a neurobiological signature. There are very specific regions in the brain that become overactive when we witness traumatic events. And what happens is this gets hardwired into the brain. In brain imaging, we call it a little diamond pattern. We see the anxiety centers are up. We see an area in the deep limbic center in the thalamus that goes up, and an area in the prefrontal cortex called the anterior cingulate gyrus. And when all of these areas are up, it yields the symptoms that we classically think of when we think of post-traumatic stress disorder: hypervigilance, heightened increase in anxiety, maybe an inability to sleep. Maybe when you're sleeping, you have nightmares, or you have sort of the reoccurring dreams of the traumas that you're seeing. And really, again, as we talked about in sleep, that's the best time for us to sort of work through and process these emotions. But if we don't do that during our sleep, and we're not getting good sleep, and we're doing this shift work, we're really not allowing our bodies to be able to process it, and our minds. And I think that's what's leading to the increased prevalence of mental health disorders in the fire service.
Yeah, it's a really a difficult issue, and I know, just having spent many years in the fire service and have seen many people retire, and then within 2 or 3 years they have some significant degenerative disease that takes them out, and it's just really, really sad to think that they didn't survive 2 to 3 years after they retired because of all of the things that we're talking about today.
Well, and I think people don't realize that those degenerative processes are happening in the brain 1 to 2 decades before they have a symptom. So you're mentioning at retirement, all of a sudden you're finding that people are having a degenerative condition, whether it's mild cognitive impairment, a dementia, a Parkinson's, or they have a chronic, inflammatory condition that leads to cardiovascular disease, stroke, or, cancers of the brain, lymphomas. So that's why the preventative things that we can do while we're in the fire service, or while people are in the fire service, are so important. When you're in your 30s and you're young and fit and healthy, start adapting and adopting more brain health protocols. Like I said, good sleep hygiene. Even if you're doing shift work, when you're not on the job, try to get a good sleep hygiene protocol in place. Give your body and brain a chance to recover. learning the right kinds of foods to eat, learning how to detoxify your body, learning the things like cleaning, your gear. I know that's already part of the protocols that you do, but it's just being really conscientious and mindful of that. So, your retirement years are a lot happier and healthier.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think that we've seen in the fire and emergency service in the last, I would say the last decade, a real focus on decontamination, not only of the gear, but now of the rig and the apparatus and of course of the person. But before that, and there's probably still are some folks that are this way, the dirtier the better.
My dad was one of those. The dirtier the better.
Yeah, the more soot you could get on you and walk around and look, pretty tough. That's just kind of how we were, brought into the service, and it's taken 30 years to kind of change that. Well, actually, it's probably taken 200 years to change that. So.
But at least it's changing, and I think that's what's really encouraging. And one thing I will share with you here is, again, coming from the field of brain imaging, I've seen that when people adopt, strategies, again, to take care of their brain health, we can reverse and improve brain function. So just like you're saying now, you're starting to adopt over the last 10 years, these protocols where you're cleaning off your gear, you're cleaning off the person, you're cleaning up the fire truck. I think this will only help to serve your long-term health and wellness, and to just know, again, from a brain health perspective, the brain is always working to support you. The things that you do to take care of it can really help and make a difference.
Yeah, I think we're much better at the cleanliness and trying to decontaminate. I think the other two areas that we've talked about today, the sleep deprivation, I don't think we've really even started down that road yet. I mean, we have a real push in the fire and emergency services to go to 48-hour shifts, and so if you think about just how that exacerbates the whole sleep disruption and deprivation over even a longer period of time. And then I think just the whole traumatic event, we're doing a good job a better job on the resource end, where we're actually, I think, more intuitive and attuned to actually recognizing this in our personnel. And there are systems in place to treat it, but we're not catching it on the front end. We're doing it after an issue emerges. And I think what you're speaking to is that there are ways that we can actually minimize ever having to go through that process, correct?
Yeah, I think what would be really important in the fire service, especially because it's still so male dominated, is that better education, access to resources, teaching people how to mitigate stress, teaching people more about anxiety and depression and PTSD. It's more about education and having conversations about it and guiding people to resources. Again, I come from the brain imaging side, so we have all kinds of really incredible tools where we can look at the way your brain is functioning. We can clearly see what post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety look like in the brain and very effectively treat it. So, we're now having those conversations, which is great. And, more of that going forward will definitely help. And I think one thing I've realized is that people just don't know what stress does inside the body. I mean, I've seen it, and I've seen what it does to the brain, and it really accelerates brain aging and, can really impact the memory centers of your brain. You're keeping the cortisol levels up, and that could, have downstream effects on your system. And I will say, with the sleep deprivation, I know you haven't really addressed it yet. Isn't cardiovascular disease one of the number one factors that impacts mortality in the fire service.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and that's, and I know I talked about this during the ADAPT Summit, a really fascinating study that looked at sleep issues in the fire service, and they found that the highest percentage of sleep issues was sleep apnea. I'd have to go back and find with that particular. Oh, here was the study. Yeah, it was a 2015 study conducted at Harvard, published in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. They looked at sleep disorders in 6,933 firefighters across 66 fire departments. And what they found is 37% of them screened positive for a sleep disorder, with 28% of them having obstructive sleep apnea, which is when you have disordered breathing. So you literally just stop breathing hundreds of times throughout the night. That obstructive sleep apnea increases your blood pressure, your heart rate, increases the risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke. So number one, we need to get that treated in the fire service. If anything, just having the routine screening for sleep apnea is a really great start. And from a brain imaging perspective, untreated sleep apnea doubles your risk for Alzheimer's disease. So while we may not be able to address the shift work and get people on a healthy sleep schedule, we can do annual screenings for sleep disorders and sleep apnea.
Wow. Yeah, it was really interesting when I visited you at the Amen Clinic, and you were sharing with me your work that you had done with the NFL players, and because we all know how the impact that they have, just the concussions that they experience over the course of their career and the damage that does to them. But to actually see that there's damage done to the brain that you can actually see in an image that has nothing to do with an exterior violent attack, right? It's actually internal.
It's internal. It's the way, so PTSD, it's the way we interpret the information. And then we have a phrase in neuroscience, we say neurons that fire together, wire together. So when we witness a traumatic event, certain neural circuits become overactive, especially ones that are in the amygdala, which is in the deep limbic brain, that are involved in our fear-related memories. So when we witness these traumatic events, we see an increase in the activity in the brain and regions, again, involved in anxiety and encoding of these traumatic events. And it's like they stay turned on for too long. And what we need to do with people who are in the fire service, we need to teach them to be able to calm those circuits down. And again, we can do this through there's dietary and lifestyle approaches, but we also have technologies like neurofeedback, where we can literally train the brain and being able to calm those circuits down. And I really see that as being a game changer for people who are in this profession, who want to maintain healthy brain function, maintain their ability to serve their communities and continue to witness these kind of events, but not have it really impact them in any negative way going forward. Trust me, if my dad was still alive, I would have him doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. We've chatted about that. So, well, it's really, really interesting information. We're kind of running up on our time today, but I'd like to bring you back for a second segment and kind of delve into what are some of the things from a dietary, supplemental, et cetera standpoint that emergency response personnel can do to start to have some impact on their brain health and their mental and physical ability as they move through their career.
I would be delighted to return and talk about that topic.
So on our second segment, we're gonna kind of delve into that. And so, Dr. Willeumier, thank you so much for being with us today. And we'll be back for a second segment when we're going to focus on some of the things that firefighters and emergency response personnel could do today to help them in the future to live a healthy and long life. So thank you, Dr. Willeumier.
Thank you so much, Chief Brugman. Thank you, Tom. It's been a pleasure being here.